Ghana and so Sabiansa and Ebano. Na Asante Danemai.
Ghana, answer na Ghana Ebano, na Asante, na Danemai.
Na one never known, Womo Becasa, Nana, Becamo, Mianco Unitrist, the young Yamomunya Baku. Nienya, ya Otesa Broche Himania, your Prime Minister.
Nienya, ya Broche Hine, nothing, no, a Prime Minister.
Then you know Ghana because I never said the refugee. Na says Kajada Tiasi and never hold the Brony and to me. Obian who obey to me.
Nice GA.
You observe on be a cover platform, so then they can message so me on notification bell. No me subscribe button. Say the next time I drop video be on sabit me akabi. Yes, and then da you say na ohwe ni twegu screen so ni ruatena se na ohwe sagranti woni mu nsensem a ode nsem bebre tudwa yes e kan nsem bebre kan e kan na de wo ma ye mo da sonko e wo me de ni se eye history na o mo cho book nim no me de no audio bebre o ya audio form de abrofo no e kan ye history abrofo na tro ene de a cho broni ni cho book mu a ye wura e da na di wo Kenya University no bese me de nyina brɛ ne na wo kan bi na wo sam pass ante wade nye de e kan mpo di abrofo no tro ye fa compare nsem a na yewura e kan ye hwa de yewura wa be unto the beginning ye nkɔhwɛ nsem a yewura kan yewura yakɔhwɛ abrofo no de na wo de yenko ye hwɛm na ye hwɛ yewura nsem na kan ne yewura ne ahwɛ abrofo no de no
enne ye awerɛhoɔ ne anigye
for say enne ye awerɛhoɔ ntini tuntum no ɛsa yɛ ne dida
na awerɛhoɔ ne sɛ yɛte baabi ani nka broni nanso obeto hye ye kuro so bɛsɛ no
awerɛhoɔ ɛne sɛ yɛte baabi yɛnka broni English broni nanso obeto hye ye so no yes
yɛnko ni krom yɛnka no
yɛnko ni krom yɛnka no
yentia ne mra biara
yentia ne mra biara
nanso opese no wotre ne die monti wose Asante atre afagana ma nyina ntisi ya nkɔ ne yemu ankɔko a sabre ne Ghana fo fa bi e de ho ama ne dada
opese wotre ne mem nam se sabre ne Ghana fa bi e de ho ama no na Asante de omde ho ya wo ba bi nti no
no nti ɔden kraba se opese one nana behia
nti ɔden kraba so opese one nana behia
na se woni no na di asema
naka kuvuka kero si minino na di asema
ma me ekobusa na oso ompese obem onaba
me ekobusa no a se da bi so oba
enunti nana ye se won pese obekun
enunti nana ye se da bi on pese obekun
nti yenkohia ne ne musa na asem kro
nti yenkohia no na asem kro na ode ba ne musa no
sanse ne wofo obedi na de kudua obaye no no de asundwe wa nko
se ne wofo obedi na de na gwa kudua na agiman ona asundwe nti no wa nko
so yes won pentokwa bia
won so yes ono so aba obedi no fa ade a won pentokwa bia
nti ma bantu ahem se mon kohwe asem kro nka
na ma osuma aba fo bantu ahem se mon ko na mon kohwe asem kro no na mon
so no free ha kra akwabo akobo no ho adwa kakra
ma na ko kakari free ha akwabo akobo no ho adwa kakra
yetia ne se ai mo pese mo beba enti ne ye beba ne abeko
no ka ne se broni ka ne se mo pese mo beba sa na tie dia ye beba ne ma ba abeko
na se je nyina ne se Asante nipa ewiase nyina enti won premier ne sa
nyina ne se Asante atretre ya hwem ya fa samre no Ghana titim Ghana no afa sa assassin bebre
na atre ko ba biara
na atre ga ende Ghana kula
na yes yenko oba ya o mu ba ye betwi fa hie bonsu aban ebe wie mu ne ma nyina
ba ye omo yesi yenko no man ti ase o mu ba betwi fa so e ma na bonsu aban be fa mu ne ma nyina ade boy
ebrada bro ni panyina oba ya wo tro book no za
symposium no so ni panyina o twa krata no o kasa no
Tom Makaski
Oka
wasisika kokko nko a wo mu wie free ha wo de kokka sema anso nko mpema ha 400,000 1,000 no more fire.
So some risk a cocoa free as say no. So the kind answer on one and no movie free.
So
Was in nay or no work was in nay so the band Nesikamua. Just a brocheska or PP 2 billion pounds.
so
Say and now they buy a Nesikamua brocheska and go PP 2 billion pounds and then case.
so
Brony no try and one Canada.
Brony or Tracata and Adana a brother or can come in commercial upon.
so
And Tina Asante Dynamite.
And Asante near Diamond.
so
And so a buyer. Yadi Nemua Bedru Ghana.
so
Buy yet and Muka Krakakra Ama is a bit Ghana.
Ghana and so Sabi and San Ebano.
so
Na Asante Dynamite.
so
Ghana, answer na Ghana Ebano, na Asante, na a Dynamite.
Onwa mi wafa kwam chitria osage my prempo to me ne lawyer kwam chitrie ayi kwam chitrie friend no Joseph Boachi dankwa
so
Ewura also onwa ne ofa nana otumfo se osage my prempo to me no. Ne lawyer JB dankwa ya bu ndina bo no.
onso na woni ne din ya de kro kwam chitrie
Onso na mo no de kwam chitrie nti no mudini e ya de kro.
e ba so ye pre independent na ye de yenka ho
so
Ba say Ghana mo pre independence Asante de nanka yenka ho.
na ho na bo no wo mo be ka se na nka ho be ka ho mi enko unity state ye mom nya ba ko
so
Onu no obeka chense na yesro be ka ho le nyina nkonkoye aban na so man ba ko.
so
ni enya ya ye otesa broche himani ya prime minister
so
Nya ya ose brochire hene na afi nso na ye prime minister.
ye nyina wo Ghana bako so na ya se de ewura fie
so
Ne atutu papa so na se ewura fie na empese ye beka na nso de ewura ken ni nyina na ewo abakose mu ewo.
so
enti nei ye wo ha ya
so
ni no kwan kro fa so ba Asante member say ya o hye na ye gina ha ye kai
so
Ne wa asi na kwan pro ni fa so ba Asante mem ebe hye ha no ese ne makọ e no ene ma ene ye gina wa ye kai.
nanso na re chiche ne se
so
Nanso na re chichire ene se
enne dua yara eniema ye wi aye no ebi kopie California museum mu
so
e biere ene ma egudia roni owi aye ebi ko ekwa America ekopia America California museum.
so
wo mo say dabi wo mo de eniema aba wo museum ni eye mako be wo mo de wo be sa de ya de abe
America fo o mo ti da bi ye de ene ma be gu museum eni e mako nso ye sa de mo ade nyina asa abrem.
so
na ye nana ye friend no Professor Henry woni abrofu di nkuta ho a da no om de si aeroplane mu na ye de aba ye de a kire nananom yi
so
Na friend Professor Antwede ene oni abofro di nkita ho a o mo di tu aeroplane mu a ene aba ma de ye hunu ni.
so
o dwasi ebe mo hu sa asem na si yampa ye fam ye nema ampa ye hu dance ye na bedru ne no
Otumfo se edwai ye mfio ha aduonum edwa ye abu ye bone de dance ye sa ampa asem no esi ya ampa ho dance ye na apiase.
so
ye gusuara me bedi ade no afi na mkwa broche hima afre me
so
So obedi ade afe na okwa broche hima no na to nsafre no.
so me ko British Museum
so
So okwa British Museum ekwohwe ho.
mam ne wo mu di nkuta ho ye nema e wo ho
Ema o mu di nkita ho ye nema ewo ho.
so
so kan se emre wo ho nti wo mu ntimi mfa ma yen
Ma o mo ka kire ni se emra ewo bretin no enu nti no o mu ntimi emfa ma ye.
so
ye beto aso adi ho nkuta ho
Na emom no ye beto aso ne di ho nkita ho.
so
epim so na da no me ya etwa mu afi etwa mu na abroche hina ye de ni si foforo oto ne nsa frɛ me
So mwana afi etwa mu bosu meto so num abrochire hene ye de si fufuro no oto ne nsafre no.
so
ka ho na ye de ka ho se me kwa mesa akɔ British Museum bio
No no okọ de ka ho se okodi a o sa akọ British Museum.
so
nam sa no mkodi nkuta ho se nema no da wo ha no me kra Asante my kra wo mti monwene ho na momfa ma yen
So no no mkodi nkita ho se nema na abedi mo no Asante ekra wo mo no an kra wo nti monhwe na momfa ya de ma ye.
so
yes emra no ntie nti na so ombetimi ni ma aye nhyehyeye
On say Amrana or won't yet name no, you bet him on why and she say,
Zoom.
If I Brunia, Professor McLeod once so, Wapa Bayas and to some better dear her, and I'm a nana boyment, you are saying, a moon woman twice in Ninkuta home.
Zoom.
Fabronim, Professor McLeod, on my back, Ghana bet that dear, and on one and an eye born, Ajiman Bia. So Mummy, Mummy, come Musiman, no moon in Kita.
Zoom.
So I was may ban crony, a bebasa, after the woman so princess, and near Mamma Kumaku, Diasam, you know. The Bebre and Emomia de Boya Bosia near the Sea and a chayas are the woman de Ama.
So Bebo Simeon Crow, Fenant, yes, you must say, name or Mafua, Makumako, a Biasam, you know, Massandia, but name Momuno, or Modeba, about the family.
So, near the Abaka, chayas are the Amayan.
So, Abahaka, chayas are the Amawu.
A catcher man, I'm Sia, Matia, Mefanasa.
Okay, Mate, Efansa.
Na kwa ya mfia wa radio num ne mba na yesi ade bema me a na me de abesia se mfia miensa na bia ya sa ato aso mfia miensa am se ne imagine sa na me manfo ahun se am pass ye befa ya makọ eneni
Zoom.
Befa ne ma akọ ye hunu dada mbe tintini ye huni na omo de ba on se mfia miensa duru o masa ama mfia miensa ka ho na ne nananom ahunu se ampa e befa ya nananom ne makọ e dia ane me prince ne dia ba.
ye nyina ye ya me ehun se nura na ye wo bibi na bibi ntini bronia po ntina ma ya yesa
ya ma obi ehun se ampa asante ne wo bibi na bibi ene bronia po nti ena ma ne ba sa.
Zoom.
enti me ne wo mon so aka se ampa mo apre so sa yeso ye bedi mra no so ye bedi nhyehyɛ no so na bibi aye kama
otumfo se ono maka sa ampa maka nhyehyɛ no me ne medi su pepepe ama bibia aye kama.
Zoom.
achiame
Zoom.
me ka wo ya ma me nanan mu nyina ehun se asante date ase
Zoom.
Otumfo se me kan kyerɛ mo ne nananom nyina so wo ka ama mahunu se ampa asante edete ase.
Zoom.
emfie wo ha ne aduonu ni broni besa ekuro no
Emfie wo ha ne aduonum ni broni obese ekuro yi
na so ye sikadwade obi ani wo timi de nsa aka
Zoom.
omo ye ekumpre numom ne ekue nyinara sikadwade obi antima pansanka
atue ko hin nyina de aba santimam sikadwa obi ansanka da
Zoom.
fie ko hin ba ye nyinara e de ba santimam ase na sikadwade omunsa anka.
Zoom.
eno ne kura santima kra
ye no sikadwa ene kura santiman ye kra
eno
Zoom.
asam to ne na santima ya bo
Zoom.
no na asam tu no ana asantiman na se abo
na se sikadwa da te ase ne wo ho de broni antimi
Zoom.
obi ani ho obetimi
Zoom.
e de tiasi ane e wo hoyi broni antimi ene obiara entimi.
Zoom.
eno na me pesa me nanan mu nyina de hu sa santima da te ase
Zoom.
no eno aka sisu dua se ne nananom opese mu hu se asantiman e da ho etiase.
Zoom.
nanan mu ade ho moja ne koje maye
Zoom.
Nanan de moja o mo moja na ko ne ji asantiman
ena asante aduane aye de sika aye de ye
Zoom.
na asante e no ya ho aduane ya de sika na aye de
Zoom.
beji sika ton
Zoom.
ji sika ne aton
ye beji sika ton
Zoom.
sika ne aton
nanan mu so anya sa
na
Zoom.
mo mo di anim no o ma anya sa
eti nei mu nyina ran fan hyem mu se o se mukum ho de gi asanteman
Zoom.
wo se na mo nyina mo fa nhyem mu ankurekure bia wo so unim se wo ya asantini die wo be ko na wadi asantiman.
Zoom.
mrantie ne maba ne nyina nya do ne ye nya akoma fanfam asanteman
Zoom.
ante ne maba nyina mo nya do emfama asantiman
Zoom.
nanan mu ye ye no
se de nananom edi kan eye no.
Yes, emitie moment se mrekra mienko hwɛ de abrofo no so kyerɛ no mo kan in audio form we audio. Yes, na intim na ye ba afeni akompani mi ni ehu de nsɛm no me fapem kosie tu de yenko no so mra ye ba ye beto aso.
Mention the British Army fighting in Africa during the 19th century and many people automatically think of the Zulus. But there was another indigenous African nation that proved a match for Queen Victoria's proud armies. Unlike the Zulus, they were not a recent political entity, but a 200-year-old empire who fought not one, but a succession of wars with the British, and armed with muskets, they held their own. Indeed, the skull of one unsuccessful British commander became a ceremonial drinking vessel in their royal palace. They were the Ashanti in modern-day Ghana, and it would take the ingenuity of one of 19th century Britain's greatest generals to better them. This is the story of General Sir Garnet Wolseley and the Third Anglo-Ashanti War of 1873-74. The Ashanti Empire had arisen back in the late 17th century. Its economic power originally came from gold, hence the European name for this region, the Gold Coast. But they soon developed a lucrative trade supplying slaves to Europeans on the coast. With their wealth, they acquired European firearms, which they used to capture more slaves, but also to establish themselves as a powerful empire in their own right in West Africa. Today, the Ashanti number about 7 million people and make up about half the population of Ghana. Back in the 1820s, the Ashanti had raided the Fanti tribe along the coast. The latter, due to their proximity to the European coastal forts, sought the protection of the British. The British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, set off in pursuit of the Ashanti army and found them. Which wasn't good news for McCarthy, as his outnumbered force were defeated, and his head taken in triumph to the Ashanti capital, where his skull purportedly became a ceremonial drinking vessel. 40 years of peace followed, with the British paying little attention to the Ashanti Empire beyond their agreed border of the Pra River. In the 1860s, however, the two sides once more came to blows after the Ashanti crossed the Pra in pursuit of a fugitive. This second Anglo-Ashanti War ended in a stalemate, with both sides actually losing more men to disease than to battle. So far then, the Ashanti had had two clashes with the British, and had proved themselves unconquerable. Not that the British were interested in conquest. In fact, now that the slave trade was long gone, many in Britain were wondering what the point was of the British being in West Africa at all. Economically, it was of little value to British manufacturers, and the climate made it totally unappealing as a place to colonise. Indeed, the few footholds that the British had on the West African coast were known as the white man's grave. Only a combination of, hardly connected concerns kept her there at all. Firstly, they felt they had a moral duty to end the slave trade. Having banned the slave trade in her own empire back in 1807, Britain, somewhat like a reformed smoker, was now on a mission to stamp out everybody else's slave trades too. Then there was pressure from merchants to protect their business concerns in the region. And these two reasons, plus a fear of European rivals, notably the French, filling the vacuum, prevented a complete withdrawal. As ever in history, small decisions led to more small decisions, and suddenly you end up in a place where, rather than some imperialist master plan, you actually scratch your head and wonder why you've ended up there at all. And that pretty much sums up the Third Ashanti War in the 1870s. Having purchased the Danish and then the Dutch trading forts along the coast during the previous 2 decades, the British found themselves in control of the coastal strip of modern-day Ghana. They declared the coastal region, which included the lands of the Fanti tribe, part of the Gold Coast Protectorate, but with no clear vision of what the future might hold. Meanwhile, in 1867, after an internal power struggle, 30-year-old Kofi Karikari became king of the Ashanti. Young, proud and fiery, the king had no time for the British or their protectorate on the coast. As far as he was concerned, these were traditional vassal territories of the ancient Ashanti Empire. And in 1873, he sent a 12,000-strong army across the border to prove who was really in charge. They reached the very walls of the former Dutch fort recently acquired by the British at Elmina, and only a determined stand by a party of Royal Navy sailors and Marines, along with members of the West Indian Regiment, prevented the fort's capture. Despite wishing to have as little to do with West Africa as possible, the British government were forced to do something. After all, the policy of establishing a protectorate was that you protected the people in the protectorate, something that the British had blatantly failed to do for the Fanti, many of whom were now being marched off by the victorious Ashanti as slaves. The problem for the British was how to respond. Firstly, apart from the armed force defending Elmina, they had no boots on the ground. Secondly, West Africa and Europeans didn't go well together. That coastal strip with its tropical heat and range of diseases had for centuries been known as the white man's grave. The recent Second Ashanti War had proved that the climate was likely to destroy a British army long before the Ashanti met it in battle. And the Ashanti were no mean army. Unlike the Zulus, they were both armed with muskets and were willing to use them in battle, with considerable effect, as you're going to hear about in a while. Traditionally, the British had relied on local tribes to provide any military support needed, augmented by men of the West Indian Regiment, who seemed to cope with the conditions better than the Europeans. The obvious answer was then to put these black troops under the command of a British officer to teach the Ashanti a lesson. But who? Cries went up in the press, especially the Times and the Daily News, to send the darling of the British public, Chinese Gordon. Charles Gordon had recently led a Chinese army during the Taiping Civil War in China. Here was a man who got the best out of local troops. But the Gold Coast and the Kingdom of the Ashanti was not China. Any advance towards the Ashanti capital of Kumasi would be through thick jungle, with only the most rudimentary of tracks. Was there anybody else who could overcome that physical challenge? Well, yes, there was. Just 3 years previously, Britain's youngest general had managed to successfully take an army through 600 miles of Canadian wilderness in the Red River expedition. And so, this bright star was called upon to lead this African campaign. Major General Garnet Wolsley. I've made a video all about the life and career of General Sir Garnet Wolsley. I'll post a link in the description below. Oh, and by the way, Charles Chinese Gordon would go on to defend Khartoum against the Mahdi in Sudan. That's another one of my videos, and again, I'll post a link below. Anyway, back to our story. The 40-year-old Wolsley was appointed Administrator and Commander-in-Chief of the Gold Coast, embarking on the ship to West Africa in mid-September 1873. He was joined on the journey by a group of 35 hand-picked officers, his fabled Ashanti Ring. Unlike most slow ocean journeys to a campaign, where officers spent their time relaxing and having fun, Wolsley used this period to plan his campaign meticulously. Ever since the Crimean War, Wolsley had kept a little black book where he collected names of officers who'd impressed him. Now he was to bring them together in a campaign that would make him a household name back home. All of these talented young officers were, like their boss, under 40, and they became known as the Ashanti Ring, or Wolsley's Gang. Many would go on to become notable names in Britain's wars in the latter half of the 19th century. Men such as Wolsley's Chief of Staff on this campaign, John McNeill. Then there was Henry Brackenbury, John Morris, Reivers Buller, William Butler, Evelyn Wood, and John Pomeroy Coley, all of whom would become generals with varying degrees of success in the British Army. By any account, that was one heck of a talented group of officers that Wolsley had assembled for this Ashanti War. Maybe I should do a video about Wolsley's Ashanti Ring. What do you think? Drop me a line in the comments section below. The government hoped that Wolsey and his rather top-heavy team of officers could lead an African army against the Ashanti. Based upon the Fante's woeful display against their northern neighbour in the recent invasion, Wolsey had his doubts. And to that end, he requested that 2 battalions of regular British troops be put on standby, should he need them. But he determined that any British force would need to arrive and be gone again inside the dry season, a narrow 3-month window from December to February, when the environmental and health conditions would be at their most benign for a European army. Upon arrival at Cape Coast Castle, his focus on the dry season was borne out. Out of his total local force, including Africans and West Indians, nearly a quarter, 160 out of 800, was sick. Amongst the 130 Europeans,
we English akosi na atro nsem nyina fa yura ho na chese wo hwe nsem na yekoso na anya nsem ketwa wate ase yura eni asantema abono mo de Ghana e be to asantema no kre menu na yura abontofa no comment section o de bia wa idea bi wo suggestion bi wo nsem bi kan wo adwenkyire bi na wetimi a kire comment section nsem ni mienu a wate no na don ti ho aba be da se wo hwe me makraw